I'm very glad we are here together today remotely. And I'm very glad to be here with the phenomenal Storm Gloor. But I wanted to first start out. I'm Gigi Johnson, and I wanted to thank MEIEA, who has helped with a research grant for faculty, has helped with this project and also been a collaborator and a co-conspirator. And many of you have been that as well. So, Storm, do you want to introduce yourself a second?
Absolutely. And it's great to see you and collaborate over these miles, Gigi, as usual. And I am Storm Gloor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where I am program director of our music business area. Gigi and I started working on some other things and involving some research. And the story of how we got here is certainly worth covering. But at this time, we are doing a research project that's going to result in a paper based on some research we're doing studying what the pandemic disruption has meant to music ecosystems, and streaming, et cetera, and also communities, because we have music cities as our emphasis in this program.
Yep.
One thing.
So I'm going to. Go ahead, please. We're going to be interrupting each other all over the place here.
Yeah,
go ahead, Storm.
Yeah,
Sorry.
And I guess we need to forward the slide, huh?
Well, I was going to say, though, that if you want to take frantic notes, we have a bit.ly, which we have here and as well as at the end, so that you can take a look at actually a longer version of this deck for your own illumination and research. And we'll have some research questions sort of going forward that this material might be great with. I also have put bit.lys throughout. So when we talk about a research resource, you'll see a bit.ly that you can get back to get all sorts of lit review, research videos, all sorts of stuff. So stay tuned for the bit.lys.
And it's a good thing we did this, or this presentation would be knocking on an hour in length. But anyway, so we started this journey in earnest when Gigi and I and some assistants started looking at the studies that have been done in music cities throughout the world. We were particularly interested, what happened from those studies and what actions took place. You'll see a map there outlining where these studies had been done by various organizations.
And back to the bit.lys at the bottom, if you'd like to see each of these studies, we've got linked to the studies as well as to where you can find this page click-throughable on the web.
Excellent. So thinking about what these studies had accomplished, what outcomes from these studies, which aren't cheap, and what might have come from those studies in terms of actionable items, was where we sort of started. And as we took a look at these things, we prepared a presentation that we were going to do later. In looking at that presentation that we were going to propose to South by Southwest, we wanted to know what challenges and what sort of solutions were emerging in various communities, and what these reports were doing to inspire solutions as they addressed their own music ecosystems at that time.
Well, we then had the pandemic question come up. So we're going to cover that in a second, but it largely is what challenges and solutions were emerging locally around the world. And then we're going to end with leading questions. Where does that take us from now? But we'll come back to that at the end of our presentation here. There are also, Storm, we looked at a lot of related literature, and you're way ahead of me on this because you've been looking at this for some time.
Yes. There's lots of work out there and lots of studies that have been done about how local economics relate to music ecosystems and what the benefits and advantages are, and how the various structures in a music ecosystem compare to others. There are organizations that have supported the creation of and improvement of ecosystems, and that have plenty of credentials and plenty of work behind them. And those organizations are listed there. And I see that Gigi, we've got a bit.ly there to also look at for further research. But there'd been so many studies done on the cultural economy and how the patterns of music ecosystems had changed through the years and been affected by various policies, etc.
And we actually may have talked to some of you to actually help pull this extensive literature review together, as everyone was seeing sort of different pieces of this really complex puzzle. So let me just talk a little bit of my journey through this. As I started in Los Angeles, so I was at UCLA, just became a emerita after 22 years in June. But in 2017, I brought a group of undergraduates together to do recorded interviews around Los Angeles. Storm already had been deeply in this space, but I was getting my feet wet with the city of LA. In February 2019, we did a Compose LA, actually series of 12 events, but at the end of it, we actually put together a conversation across Los Angeles with the city, Department of Planning, bringing these questions to the forefront. What is Los Angeles music? Where are we going? Where do we want to go? Storm then, and some of you came and participated remotely with the Future of Music in LA conference. Storm moderated a great virtual panel. It's like we were in the pandemic before we were in the pandemic, with hybrid conferences. And then we continued in LA, moving the conversation to a live event on the West Side, looking at the future of music in West Los Angeles. And West LA is a really interesting space with really expensive real estate and almost no venues. So what happens when you outprice through gentrification and everything else, what you can afford to do? So it was an interesting ecosystem study, and that was in percolation. And then, Storm, we thought we were going to talk at South by.
Yes. We South by was going to host our presentation on what our findings were up to that point. And I think, Gigi, correct me if I'm wrong, you were literally getting on the plane, so to speak.
I think I was a day away from getting on the plane.
Very close to it, but we were headed to South by Southwest. And as those of you here today know, that was canceled. So we found ourselves all dressed up and no place to go from a research standpoint. And as we talked about, not letting our work go to immediate waste, surely we had long-term plans, but we contemplated, and Gigi, I don't know what you were drinking or I was drinking at the time.
I don't know. This was a long-term
We
problem.
got the idea to run a 25-hour virtual conference. This is before, other conferences.
Well, we thought it'd be a 4-hour conference. I think the initial design was a 4-hour, a bunch of 20 and 30-minute sessions. And Storm knows people, and I know people. And then we started adding more people. And I think then you added Australia, then India. And then it was like, how do we do this? And how do we deal with the time zone? So I do think my whole moniker on this was, what were we thinking?
Absolutely.
So we did put together the conference.
Yes, and after looking at these reports and talking to people in these various communities and even beyond that, we brought everyone together for this conference and represented. And let folks represent where they stood. It absolutely turned into, of course, naturally more of a pandemic discussion, but very much relating to what they knew about their ecosystems prior to the pandemic's emergence. So we put together this conference, and it not only gave this platform through this convening for folks to share what was going on in their respective communities, but we also found that there were people doing similar work over here and over there that got to know each other. And I know several of you who are watching today were probably part of that conference. So we completed that, and you see the link there if you'd like to go check out any of the programming that was done as part of that conference in 2020. And that would be, as you see, April 2020, just mere weeks into the pandemic.
So we ended up with more than 100 speakers and 25 hours of content, which then turned into 39 videos, which you can find at that link on YouTube. And then we got to 2021.
Here we were a year later. And again, I ask you, Gigi, what were we drinking and or thinking? And but we looked, whereas in 2020, we were talking about what it might look like when venues opened up in October of that year. Now we were a year into it. And we wanted to see what might be happening in the communities now versus then, sort of an apples to apples. And that meant, to a great extent, inviting the same communities back into the conversation. However, we weren't going to do 25 hours straight again, and we were going to have to look at an alternate way of pulling this off. we did have in this conference, as you see, 45 companies represented, 135 plus speakers, uh, but um, but we spread it out differently, and we weren't going to do the 25-hour consecutive thing, and instead we were going to do what we call international sessions, where we pinpoint directly to representatives of the music ecosystems in various areas and did separate programming just around there. And as we thought about doing that, we knew that this would make our research more robust around those communities when we could center on them separately rather than just include them amongst the other presentations at Amplify 2021. Anything else you would add to that, Gigi?
Well, we learned a lot. We joined a lot more people together. We also began, which we don't tend to mention on this, we also started showing up at other people's conferences. So we started being part of Be Present Everywhere, which I think went to 12 different conferences around the world. So we were also learning from other people's events in this virtual time and meeting hordes of people. But we have a playlist for that. And we ended up with 28 video, and we turned this also into a podcast. So we extended the reach. And we were then sponsored by all sorts of great folks, MEIEA being one of the big supporters of this, as well as the international office in your shop, Storm, right?
Yes, yes. The international department here at the University of Colorado, Denver.
So we were blessed by support from them. So as Storm mentioned, Storm, share thoughts on the international sessions that I think we learned a lot from them in a lot of weird ways.
Yes, and just to make it a little comedic, for our timing was kind of crazy. It seems that we would set up a session with a various area, and we would record, and then lo and behold, a second surge of the pandemic would hit them soon after. It didn't matter where we went. If we talked to Japan, and then just a couple of weeks later, they have their second wave. India, same thing. But that's an aside. But as we talked to these folks, we found definitely that longitudinally thinking about where they were at that stage, we did find differences.
And a lot of differences, and some of these we had talked to them in the first year. So, example, we had a session around New Orleans about how Katrina prepared them in terms of structure underneath the music industry to be part of what they were going into the beginning of the pandemic. We were able to bracket that and come back later on it. So we have 6 published sessions: Colorado, Japan, India, Australia, New Orleans, and then we recorded but didn't put video out for Northwest Arkansas. And in part, we found a lot of, I'm assuming many of you have done focus group and video-based interviews. We tended to have a lot of interesting challenges, selection challenges, convenient sampling problems, and then just trying to chase people down. So I want to give a shout out to Alex Dolvin, who I know is deeply involved with MEIEA virtually and virtually online. But in many ways, he was some of the magicians between Storm, myself, and some other interns and independent contractors really helped bring this together. But we got to a point that, first of all, people were dealing with recovery, and then trying to bring a group of people together as they were attempting now to go forth in their business. And we're dealing with COVID ripples and bursts. And I was just thinking that we've been trying to do China, and China, of course, now is having its own COVID challenges. So, Storm, can I maybe move into where we got to then from this as to research data?
You bet.
Okay. So this is a qualitative study, and in many ways it's a narrative study. It's people telling stories about what they perceive as happening from their seat in their communities. What we ended up with then is 73 semi-structured video interviews across the 2 years in more than 30 regions in more than 20 countries. So we have a really rich archive. And we don't just have the archive, we have transcripts, we have, in some cases, contemporaneous research. We also have the summaries and published details from those now. I think it's more than 75. Nashville's now done a post-pandemic or mid-pandemic study. And then access to raw research data, not just the published studies, but on some of these, we have access to their archives. And then we have continuing conversations with these interviews. So what we've been working through, including using Deduce, we've been trying to do narrative and thematic analysis but also take a look at kind of the ebbs and flows of action, governance, things happening, and how to model that from the information. And then also been using 2 different AI-assisted transcription elements, so that gives us those materials. And we have all that for those of you who, and your students who may want to then work in this space with us. But we thought we'd be done by now, right? So when we first did this, we thought we're bringing the band together, having these 30 organizations meet, share what they're doing, bring their thought leaders to the table. Then we thought we're doing it again, but uncertainty continues. So we keep looking at each other like, are we done? What are we doing with this? We're still hip deep in change. We've got countries still coming into the pandemic and others that are dealing with the various results of the pandemic. We've got venues open in most of the world, but it really is a difference in can a venue run on a 40% capacity, or what's happening with new festivals, new venues. We have large shifts in workforce. The Great Resignation has not been unknown in this space, as well as massive supply chain issues. I don't know, I was kind of shrugging my shoulders at the point in time where people couldn't get wings, and that was always, to me, kind of quirky and funny. But massive disruptions in nightlife, massive disruptions on central business districts, which a lot of venues actually tend to be around. But then different political activities, actions, government work really made this looking at, 30 plus different types of interventions. And so trying to make sense of the storytelling about what worked and what didn't becomes more of a story of vignettes, and sort of thinking about recurring themes, which we're working on. And again, as Storm mentioned, we were interviewing the communities right before then they got locked down again in 2021. So we felt kind of bad sometimes about doing these. We would then be editing them, putting them out, and then they'd be back on lockdown.
Yeah, that was crazy.
So themes that came up is that we saw emergent organizing, and that change that otherwise would have taken some massive organization happened quickly. So one was MEIEA. In fact, MEIEA ended up making part of their announcement that they were starting the week of Amplify 2020. So we were enjoying having some of their first announcements and discussions coming actually at our virtual event. But what happened there is then it catalyzed into local chapters, which became interesting. But then you had other national associations. Talent organizing came out. Nighttime.org in Berlin really stepped up what it already had in global night mayors to deal with that. And now even you have a Nightcap Alliance coming out of the UK, so that you had organizing happening. And some of the question gets to be now, what happens with these coming after the pandemic? And then you had lots of systemic shifts. So we're going to leave a lot of this that you guys can take a look at in the deck and other materials, and it will be in the paper that comes out of this and other resulting materials. But the need to act locally, and a lot of cities really saying what happens to live performer income and what's the ecosystem to support the rest of it, got to be a key issue in many locations. New Orleans and Nashville, music tourism dramatically impacted. And I think I have later in the slide here that the ability to cross borders, which already at times was a challenge for live music, now became a gigantic issue of uncertainty. But you have some that still, it's really challenging. China not letting people in, challenges with crossing into Australia and Canada. So border crossings for artists, a really big problem. New revenue and support models, be it money coming in to sustain artists in various countries, or really looking at online streaming, which got to 70,000 tracks a day uploaded to Spotify. Now we're at 75,000 supposedly. So a burst of creative output into the streaming services, a lot of things happening, a lot of artists becoming virtual producers, music education moving online, and a big expansion of machine learning and artificial intelligence embedded tools to make things easier, and the whole creator economy taking a gigantic boom during this time. And new investors on a creative tool ecosystem. And in fact, before with this recording, I was being pitched on yet another creator blockchain, royalty sales tool that have all come into this space right now, seeing this transition in the business. A burst of sales in musical instrument and digital audio workstations as people became creators in their homes. And then all these new metaverse tools. I don't even want to talk about the metaverse, but a lot of people kind of going through 5 years of digital shift into. And then contracts and risk sharing. That could be a session here all by itself
It could,
on
yeah.
the role of insurance and contracts and who takes what risk going forward. I'll try to hit this fairly quickly in the fact that the relationship with government became a gigantic issue. Depending on what geography we talk to, real feelings of neglect or anger. I mean, I would say we heard a lot of anger in a lot of these conversations. Storm, any thoughts on that?
Yes, yes, we did, and a sort of as the situation drew on, that grew. In fact,
Yeah, and in some cases, extreme disappointment and frustration, which became an interesting piece of the puzzle. We heard it extensively in Japan. We've heard it separately from conversations with the UK. India, no ecosystems of support for live performance going into the pandemic. And so really, there was real differences on what pre-existed. There was, though, strong support in Canada, including liability insurance being paid for by the government and supporting touring within the country. So we really saw big differences in what different countries were willing to step up and do. And then, NEVA's support getting a $15 billion response, but then pushing that through the Small Business Administration and being like a drip, drip, drip heading out in an organization not ready to be dealing with that vast new ecosystem of creators to work with. Real big differences in county and local governments. And then, the same stuff that the city studies that got us started down this journey. Here's all the problems. Those problems all came home to roost during the pandemic. Some folks really stepped up. You can take a look at vibe-lab.org and see all of the really great ecosystem and nightlife studies that they've done based out of Berlin as a really interesting example of how you can step up during the pandemic to bring people together to really look at their communities, largely across actually Europe and Africa. They've done some really amazing African studies through this. And then folks like the Music Venue Trust out of the UK, who already for 5 years was working deeply with the UK government, who's now looking to create whole new real estate ownership structures to come out of the pandemic. So they were probably furthest in and being ready for the pandemic and probably the furthest in to want to make some drastic changes coming out of the pandemic.
Yes, great work they've been doing already.
So I'm glad to hook you guys up with any of this stuff. So the area that I'm excited about coming out of this is the question of what happens now with space. That a venue, is not necessarily coming back the way it was, and there's been alternate space uses. So there's been civic capture and financing of new spaces, Music Venue Trust, as we just were talking about. In LA, local government, not city government, even more local, is buying up empty stores for local arts, and we're seeing that in other cities as well. We're seeing a whole pop-up culture, which was pre-pandemic, really growing, kind of like ghost kitchens have during the pandemic, that I don't need a restaurant to be serving food, that the whole pop-up culture, especially in a lot of communities of color, have basically said, we're going to create whole new structures. So that we're beginning to see all over the place. A lot of course, was coming outdoors for dining and community music, and now new structures continuing post or mid-pandemic, and of course, the whole ecosystems of impromptu performances across many cities. And then a whole burst in cross-national virtual performances between countries and between communities that otherwise would not have gotten a purchase. So do I need a place to be doing music, or can there be whole new ways of thinking of that? And those are some events, actually, I'm working with at the Rethink Next nonprofit for this coming year to take a look at this in various communities. And so, what happens when you're not connecting local globally? So some of this stuff is also tying up with other industries. We saw a lot of rethinking of place that connects music places to TV and film recording places, and all sorts of new ways to take production space and make it not just for evening music anymore. And shifting, and I think I covered this a bit in the prior slide, but a lot of it is, what does it mean then to be incentivizing the return to music, and how are cities measuring this result? And I would contest, and I would love to hear from you guys in the Q&A, are you seeing measurement of the return other than the really interesting study Nashville has put together. And then what happens with permitting, because it was broken in many cities ahead of the pandemic. And the New York restaurant scene is seeing that as a continuing issue about who has the permission to use what spaces for what. So, Storm, where are we now then?
Well, as we continue doing this work, we've gotten some surveys. These surveys done beyond just the cities that we've been working with and gathered this feedback. We're going to continue to look at some other cities and communities and regions. As Gigi mentioned earlier, China is still
And in part,
in play
we're at
at some
2 years
point.
in, too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2 years in, we're at the question, do we do this again? And I think that our families and ourselves are going, no. But we are going to put a survey out that we're recording this in March, and we're going to talk about this in May. So by the time we get together, we should have done the survey out back to what is emerging. We have, of course, had survey fatigue coming up from folks. So we'll see what we actually have of that coming out of it. And then, we have had challenges. We've been trying to talk to China, Philippines, Canada, and even in LA with support from MEIEA and CU Denver's IIB Cyber Center. And getting people to respond, people are tired. And so thinking about, do we collect additional data? Do you want to help us collect additional data? And my challenge with Los Angeles is almost everyone I was working with has changed jobs. So the people I was working with, City of LA, are actually now in Beverly Hills. And the people who were doing economic studies are now in a new company. So a little bit of the changing people aspect of not just the Great Resignation, but the great musical chairs. And then we're doing analysis continuing from this and the paper that Storm mentioned that we're going to submit to the MEIEA Journal. We got stuff. And Storm, we kind of have stuff for them, right? That we have 73 videos and audio recordings. Would you or your students like to see these transcripts? Would you like to take a look at this and use it? We've got secondary research summaries for another 7 countries, which are available on request and will be online. And we've got one of our wonderful master's student interns put together a how-to guide for student researchers to look at their own music ecosystem that we've had requests from when we presented this work to other folks. Mm-hmm. So here we are now. How are communities changing? How are they differing? And would your students and would you like to work together on taking a look at any of this going forward where you are? Storm, anything else we wanted to share here other than please reach out to us?
I think that's it, and I would just reiterate what Gigi said: is that we've got this library of resources, and we're certainly open to letting anyone use them, and hoping that you will utilize them if possible. That's it.
And if this connects up with your work, reach out, Storm. As usual, it is wonderful talking with you, and I believe we're now heading into the Q&A.